The crimson dust of Kepler 442b swirled in violent spirals as the Vorthak Empire's war machines thundered across the barren landscape. Each step of their towering siege walkers sent tremors through the colonial settlements below, while overhead, their atmospheric processors blotted out the twin suns with their metallic bulk. Commander Daxiel Moore stood atop his command vessel, 6 arms crossed in satisfaction as he surveyed the pathetic human defenses. The species that called themselves Terrans had spread across 17 systems in the past century, establishing their fragile colonies with the naive optimism of children playing in a sandbox. Now, the Vorthak would remind the galaxy why they had conquered 43 civilizations in the past millennium. "Their plasma barriers are already failing," reported his tactical officer, mandibles clicking with amusement. "These mammals can barely maintain coherent energy fields for more than a few rotations." The human colony of New Byzantium stretched. Before them, a collection of crystalline towers and agricultural domes that housed nearly 2 million souls. Daxiel Moore had studied the species extensively. Humans were remarkably adaptable for such short-lived creatures, but they lacked the bone density for true combat, the neural pathways for quantum processing, and most critically, the cultural unity that forged true empires. As his forces advanced, emergency broadcasts crackled through the colony's communication networks. Desperate voices pleaded for evacuation ships, for military reinforcements, for miracles that wouldn't come. The nearest human naval fleet was 6 days away, 6 days too late. "Begin the harvesting protocols," Daxiel Moore commanded. The Vorthak didn't simply conquer, they absorbed. Every species they encountered was catalogued, studied, and either incorporated into their empire or eliminated as inefficient. Humans, with their chaotic individualism and emotional volatility, would likely fall into the latter category. The first human defensive position crumbled within minutes. Their railgun emplacements, impressive by primitive standards, barely scratched. The Vorthak war machines' reactive armor. Civilian evacuation shuttles rose from the colony like startled birds, only to be methodically intercepted by hunter-killer drones. But then something changed in the star-scattered darkness above. Lieutenant Cass Valderon, monitoring long-range sensors from her bunker deep beneath New Byzantium, noticed it first. A gravitational anomaly was approaching from the outer system, something large enough to bend light around its hull, yet somehow invisible to their most advanced detection arrays. "Sir, we're reading massive space-time distortions approximately 12 astronomical units out," she reported to Colonial Defense Coordinator Ryvan Ashcraft. "Whatever it is, it's big. Dreadnought class, maybe bigger." Ashcraft frowned at the display. No human vessel matched those readings, and their automated warning systems should have detected any approaching ship days ago. The signature was wrong. Too clean, too perfectly calibrated, as if the laws of physics bent around it rather than being forced to accommodate it. Above the surface, Daxiel Moore's forces had surrounded the colony's primary shield generator. Victory was inevitable, a mathematical certainty that had played out across dozens of worlds. The Vorthak had perfected the art of conquest through overwhelming technological superiority and calculated brutality. Yet something nagged at the commander's consciousness as he gazed up at the alien stars. In all their campaigns across the galaxy, they had encountered species that fought with courage, cunning, even desperate ingenuity. But humans were different. Their military databases contained scattered reports of impossible victories, of overwhelming odds somehow reversed by these seemingly fragile creatures. The Imperiate High Command had dismissed such reports as propaganda or statistical anomalies. After all, how could a species that hadn't even achieved true faster-than-light travel pose any significant threat to the galaxy's apex predators? As if summoned by his thoughts, the darkness between the stars began to shift. The thing that emerged from the void defied conventional understanding of spacecraft design. Where Vorthak vessels were all angles and brutal efficiency, metallic wedges designed to split space itself, this craft seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its surface rippled like liquid obsidian, and its impossible geometry suggested dimensions that human mathematics couldn't properly describe. Daxiel Moore's sensor arrays screamed warnings as the craft materialized within their perimeter without triggering a single proximity alarm. It simply appeared as if it had always been there, and reality was just now catching up to the fact. "Commander," his tactical officer's voice carried an unfamiliar tremor. "We're reading massive energy signatures from the unidentified vessel, but our targeting systems can't achieve lock-on. It's as if our weapons don't recognize it as a valid target." The black ship hung motionless in space, roughly pyramid-shaped, but with surfaces that seemed to fold in on themselves in optically impossible ways. No running lights, no visible engines, no communication arrays, yet somehow it radiated a presence that made even the battle-hardened Vorthak officers step back from their consoles. Down in the bunker, Cass Valderon's instruments were going haywire. The mysterious vessel registered on gravitational sensors but showed up as empty space on electromagnetic scans. It had mass but no heat signature, displacement but no apparent propulsion. "Coordinator Ashcraft," she called out, her voice tight, with professional restraint masking deeper unease. "The anomaly is holding position approximately 30,000 kilometers above the colony. I'm detecting—" This is going to sound insane, but I'm detecting quantum signatures that don't match any known technology. Ashcraft moved to look over her shoulder at the display. The readouts showed patterns that violated several fundamental laws of physics. Energy readings that suggested the craft was simultaneously drawing power from and feeding power into the quantum vacuum itself. Could it be some kind of experimental human technology? He asked, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew better. Humanity's most advanced ships were elegant achievements of engineering, but they were still bound by the same physical laws that governed everything else in the universe. "Sir, with respect, we're barely able to manipulate quantum fields for our jump drives. This thing appears to be using quantum mechanics as a construction material." Above them, Daxiel Moore was experiencing his first moments of tactical uncertainty in over 2 centuries of warfare. The Vorthak Empire had encountered exactly 3 species in their history that possessed technology superior to their own. 2 of those encounters had ended in costly stalemates that eventually led to negotiated borders. The third had resulted in the complete evacuation of 17 Vorthak systems. "Attempt to establish communication," he ordered. "Standard diplomatic protocols, then military challenges if they don't respond." The communications officer worked frantically at his station for several minutes before looking up with confusion. "Commander, the craft is receiving our transmissions. I can detect the signal interaction, but it's not responding. It's almost as if it's listening, but choosing not to answer." "Then we treat it as a hostile," Daxiel Moore decided. "All batteries, target the unknown vessel. If it won't communicate, it will be eliminated." The Vorthak battle fleet opened fire with enough concentrated energy to level mountains. Plasma cannons, particle beams, and quantum torpedoes converged on the black ship's position in a display of firepower that had reduced entire fleets to vapor. The weapons simply passed through empty space where the craft had been. Not absorbed, not deflected. The ship had simply ceased to occupy that particular location in space-time, reappearing an instant later exactly where it had been before, completely unaffected. "Impossible," breathed the tactical officer. "Nothing can move that fast. The acceleration alone would turn any crew to paste." But Daxiel Moore was beginning to suspect that conventional physics might not apply to whatever they were facing. In the deepest archives of the Vorthak Imperial Library were legends, stories dismissed as primitive mythology, of ships that sailed the void before the first civilizations learned to make fire. Ancient things that emerged from the dark between. Stars when the galaxy's youngest species grew too bold, too confident in their own power. The humans below watched in stunned silence as their world's would-be conquerors unleashed everything they had against the mysterious craft. The black ship absorbed or avoided every attack with an almost casual indifference, as if the Vorthak fleet were children throwing stones at a mountain, and then, without warning or announcement, it began to move. The black ship's movement defied every law of motion that governed the physical universe. It didn't accelerate. It simply transitioned from one position to another, as if space itself was rearranging to accommodate its presence. One moment it hung motionless above New Byzantium. The next, it was alongside the lead Vorthak dreadnought, close enough that Daxiel Moore could see his own bridge lights reflecting off its impossibly dark hull. "All ships! Evasive maneuvers!" the commander barked, but his order came too late. The black ship had already selected its first target. What happened next would be debated in military academies across the galaxy for generations to come, if anyone survived to remember it. The Vorthak destroyer Apex Predator, a vessel that had personally conquered 12 systems and housed over 3,000 crew members, simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed in any conventional sense. No explosion, no debris field, no energy discharge. It was there, then it wasn't. As if the universe had decided that particular arrangement of matter and energy had never existed in the first place. Tactical. "Report!" Daxiel Moore demanded, though his voice carried less authority than before. A commander could only maintain confidence in the face of impossibility for so long. "The destroyer is gone, sir. No weapon signatures detected. No energy transfer recorded. It's as if it just unraveled." Lieutenant Cass Valderon watched the impossible scene unfold through her instruments, her scientific training warring, with the evidence before her eyes. The missing Vorthak ship had left behind a perfectly spherical void in space. Not empty space, but actual nothingness, a region where even background radiation couldn't penetrate. "Coordinator," she called out, her voice barely steady. "I'm detecting quantum signature changes throughout the engagement zone. Whatever that ship is doing, it's not using conventional weapons. It's editing reality." The black ship continued, its work with methodical precision. A Vorthak carrier vanished next, followed by 2 escort cruisers. Each disappearance was instantaneous and complete, leaving behind only spherical voids that gradually filled with normal space-time over the course of several minutes. Daxiel Moore had commanded fleets in 47 major battles and had never experienced anything remotely resembling fear. The Vorthak Empire had built itself on the principle of absolute technological superiority. They conquered because they were simply better than everyone else. But this craft was demonstrating capabilities that transcended technology entirely. "All ships, fall back to minimum safe distance," he ordered, though he wasn't sure such a distance existed. "Deploy quantum scramblers and dimensional anchors." The Vorthak's most advanced defensive systems activated, creating layers of twisted space-time designed to prevent enemy vessels from achieving dimensional displacement. The technology had been successful against the few species that had developed basic teleportation capabilities. The black ship ignored the defensive barriers as if they were suggestions rather than physical laws. It moved through the quantum scramblers, like a knife through water, selecting targets with what appeared to be deliberate consideration. Not random destruction, there was a pattern to its choices, a logic that Daxiel Moore couldn't quite grasp. Down on the planet's surface, the human colonists had stopped their evacuation efforts and were now watching the impossible battle unfold in their skies. Emergency broadcasts filled the communication networks as people tried to make sense of what they were witnessing. "This is Colonial Defense Coordinator Ashcraft broadcasting on all frequencies," came the steady voice through the static. "All civilians remain in designated safe zones. We are observing an unknown vessel engaging the Vorthak fleet. Repeat, Unknown vessel of unidentified origin is engaging enemy forces above New Byzantium. But Cass Valderon was beginning to piece together a more disturbing truth. The Black Ship wasn't just randomly eliminating Vorthak vessels. It was being selective. Command ships, heavy weapons platforms, troop carriers. It was systematically dismantling the invasion force's ability to conduct warfare while leaving support vessels and smaller craft intact. "Sir," she reported to Ashcraft, "I think the unknown vessel is surgically removing military assets. It's not destroying everything, it's neutralizing the Vorthak's capacity for conquest." As if to confirm her observation, the Black Ship moved toward a massive Vorthak troop transport carrying 50,000 ground soldiers. The vessel attempted to flee, its engines burning at maximum power, but distance meant nothing to something that could simply choose to be elsewhere. The transport vanished like all the others, leaving behind only empty space and the terrified communications of the remaining Vorthak fleet. But this time, something different happened. The spherical void, left by the transport's disappearance, didn't gradually fill with normal spacetime. Instead, it began to pulse with a faint, almost organic rhythm, as if something was gestating within the nothingness itself. Daxiel Moore stared at the pulsing void and felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries: the cold touch of true fear. The pulsing void where the Vorthak troop transport had vanished began to emit a low-frequency signal that penetrated every hull in the fleet. It wasn't heard so much as felt. A rhythmic vibration that seemed to resonate in the bones of every living creature within 100,000 kilometers. Daxiel Moore's medical officer reported that several crew members had collapsed, their neural implants overloading from the strange frequency. The commander himself felt a growing pressure behind his compound eyes, as if something was trying to force its way into his consciousness. Analysis of the signal. "Immediately," he ordered, though his tactical staff was already working frantically at their stations. "Sir, the frequency appears to be some form of quantum resonance pattern. It's not random, there's definitely an intelligence behind it. It's almost like a language, but operating on principles we don't understand." The Black Ship had ceased its systematic elimination of Vorthak vessels and now hung motionless in space, apparently waiting for something. Around it, the surviving members of the invasion fleet, roughly 60% of the original force, maintained their positions with the desperate hope that remaining still might preserve their lives. Down on New Byzantium, Cass Valderon was running every analysis she could think of on the mysterious signal. Her instruments were detecting patterns within patterns, mathematical structures that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond the standard 4 of spacetime. "Coordinator, I think. It's trying to communicate," she reported, though the words felt inadequate. "Not with us directly, but with something. The signal is being broadcast in all directions, but it's also being aimed at specific coordinates throughout the galaxy." Ashcraft studied the data streaming across her console. "Coordinates to what?" "I don't know, sir. But based on the signal strength and focus, whatever it's calling to is big. Really big." The answer came from an unexpected source. Throughout the Vorthak fleet, senior officers began receiving priority communications from their home world, not from military command, but from the Imperial Archaeological Service. Dr. Vexhani Kell, the Empire's leading xenoarchaeologist, appeared on emergency channels with a message that would reshape their understanding of galactic history. "All fleet commanders are to cease hostile actions immediately," came the urgent transmission. "We have identified the unknown vessel from our deepest historical archives. It matches descriptions found in ruins across 17 different systems. Ruins that predate the oldest known civilizations by millions of years." Daxiel Moore felt his confidence crumble completely. The Vorthak Empire prided itself on having the most complete historical records in the galaxy, dating back over 500,000 years. If Dr. Vexhani Kell was referencing artifacts that were millions of years old, the vessel appears to be of Guardian origin. the archaeologist continued. Ancient texts refer to them as the eternal shepherds, entities that emerged from the deep void when younger species threatened the balance of galactic civilization. Commander, you are facing something that was old when our species was still learning to make fire. The pulsing void suddenly flared with brilliant light, and when the radiance faded, the missing Vorthak vessels began to reappear. Not as wreckage or debris, but intact and apparently undamaged. However, there was something fundamentally different about them. Each returning ship was completely empty, not destroyed, not even damaged, simply devoid of any living crew. The vessels floated in perfect formation, their systems operational, their weapons powered down, their life support maintaining perfect environmental conditions for occupants that were no longer there. "Where are they?" whispered Daxiel Moore, staring at the ghost fleet that had been his vanguard just minutes before. "Where are my soldiers?" The answer came not from his tactical staff, but from the black ship itself. For the first time since its arrival, the craft opened communication channels and spoke directly to the Vorthak commander. The voice that emerged from the speakers was unlike anything in their xenolinguistic databases, not the sound of vocal chords or artificial synthesis, but something deeper. It was the sound of stars being born, of galaxies turning in their eternal dance, of time itself given voice. "They have been preserved," the entity said, its words somehow translating perfectly into every language simultaneously. "Your warriors sleep in a place between moments, held in stasis until they can be returned to worlds that will not echo with the screams of the conquered." Daxiel Moore found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What? What are you?" "We are what remains when civilizations forget their place in the greater symphony," came the reply. "We are the keepers of balance, the shepherds of mercy, the final arbiters when the young grow too proud of their weapons." The black ship began to move again, not toward the remaining Vorthak vessels, but toward something else entirely, a trajectory that would take it deeper into the system, toward the Vorthak Empire's territorial borders. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Vorthak fleet and the human colony alike. Lieutenant Cass Valderon worked frantically to decode the implications of what they had just witnessed, her instruments detecting massive energy buildups throughout the outer system. The Guardian, for that was apparently what the black ship truly was, had done more than simply neutralize a single invasion force. It had sent a message that was spreading across subspace at faster-than-light speeds, reaching every corner of Vorthak territory. "Coordinator Ashcraft," she reported, her voice tight with barely controlled amazement, "we're detecting response signals from everywhere. Every major Vorthak world, every fleet position, every military installation. Whatever that ship just broadcast, it's causing a galaxy-wide reaction." The responses were not what anyone expected. Across the vast expanse of the Vorthak Empire, identical black ships began to materialize above every conquered world, every military base, every slave colony where the Empire had established its brutal dominion. The Guardians had not sent a single vessel to deal with a minor human colony. They had deployed their entire dormant fleet to address a problem that had been growing for centuries. Daxiel Moore received fragmentary reports from across the Empire as his communications network became flooded with desperate signals. The fortress world of Krexthal Prime, home to the Empire's most advanced military academies, had gone completely silent after a Guardian ship appeared in its orbit. The slave mining operations of the Xerion cluster had simply stopped, with reports of millions of enslaved beings vanishing without a trace, leaving behind empty facilities and confused overseers. "Sir," his communications officer reported with a trembling voice, "we're receiving direct orders from the High Imperiate. All military operations are to cease immediately. All conquered territories are to be evacuated." The word evacuated carried implications that made Daxiel Moore's blood run cold. The Vorthak Empire had never evacuated anything. They conquered, They occupied, they held until the heat death of the universe if necessary. The idea of voluntary withdrawal was so alien to their culture that their language barely had words for it. But then came the reports that explained everything. Throughout the Empire, the missing crews of vanished warships had begun to reappear, not in their vessels, but on their homeworlds, in the capital cities, in the very heart of Vorthak civilization. They appeared in perfect health, but with no memory of their disappearance, and no understanding of how they had traveled across vast distances instantaneously. More disturbing were the reports that came with them. Each returned warrior carried the same message, spoken in their own voice, but with words that clearly came from another source. The harvest ends. The shepherds have awakened. The conquered shall be free. Dr. Vex Hanikel's follow-up transmission provided context that shattered the Empire's fundamental understanding of galactic history. The Guardian artifacts we've studied across the galaxy weren't random archaeological finds, she explained to the fleet commanders. They were monitoring stations. The Guardians have been watching civilizations rise and fall for millions of years, intervening only when a species threatens to upset the fundamental balance of galactic development. The implications were staggering. The Vorthak Empire, which had considered itself the apex of galactic civilization, was apparently just another young species that had grown too confident in its own power. The technology they had developed, the worlds they had conquered, the cultures they had absorbed, all of it had been permitted to exist only as long as it served some greater purpose that they couldn't even comprehend. On New Byzantium, the human colonists watched in amazement as the Vorthak invasion force began to withdraw. The massive siege walkers that had been preparing to level their cities simply powered down and began moving toward extraction points. The atmospheric processors that had been poisoning their skies shut down and began retracting their deployment. Arrays. But the Guardians weren't finished. The black ship that had single-handedly neutralized the invasion force turned its attention to the humans below, and for a moment, Coordinator Ashcraft felt the same terror that had gripped Daxiel Moore. Were they next? Had humanity also grown too ambitious, too aggressive in their expansion across the stars? The Guardian's voice filled the communication channels of New Byzantium, but this time it carried a different tone, not the terrible judgment that had fallen upon the Vorthak, but something that might have been approval. Young shepherds, it said, the words somehow carrying warmth despite their alien origin. Your species shows promise. You fight when you must, but you do not conquer for the sake of conquest. You spread across the stars, but you do not poison the worlds you touch. Continue on your current path, and in time you may join us in watching over the galaxy's younger children. With that, the Guardian ship began to fade from normal space-time, becoming translucent and then invisible as it slipped back into whatever dimension it had emerged from. But before it vanished completely, it left behind a gift that would change human civilization forever. The artifact that materialized in orbit above New Byzantium defied immediate classification. It wasn't technology, in any sense that humans understood. No moving parts, no energy signatures, no materials that registered on their sensors. Instead, it appeared to be a geometric construct of pure information, a crystalline structure that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human mathematics could barely describe. Lieutenant Cass Valderon was among the first to study the object as it settled into a stable orbit around their world. Her instruments detected patterns of incredible complexity flowing through its structure, not data streams, but something more fundamental. It was as if the artifact contained blueprints for rewriting the basic laws of physics themselves. Coordinator, she reported, her voice filled with wonder. I think it's some kind of knowledge repository. But not just information storage. It's actively interfacing with our quantum sensors and teaching our computers how to process concepts they've never encountered before. the gift was more profound than anyone initially realized. As human scientists began to study the Guardian artifact, they discovered that it was gradually upgrading their understanding of fundamental science. Concepts that had been theoretical became practical. Technologies that had seemed impossible became merely challenging. Within days, human engineers were developing faster-than-light communication systems that operated on principles the Guardians had apparently mastered millions of years ago. Their medical technology advanced by centuries as the artifact revealed the quantum foundations of biological processes. Most importantly, they began to understand their role in the galaxy's larger ecosystem. The Vorthak Empire, meanwhile, was undergoing its own transformation. The systematic withdrawal from conquered territories continued, but it wasn't the chaotic collapse that many had expected. Instead, the Guardians seemed to be guiding the process, ensuring that abandoned colonies could sustain themselves and that enslaved populations were gradually granted the resources needed for independence. Daxiel Moore found himself in the unprecedented position of overseeing the peaceful evacuation of worlds his people had conquered through violence. The experience was educational. For the first time in his long military career, he witnessed the perspectives of those his empire had subjugated, and the revelation was deeply unsettling. The mining world of Epsilon Ceti had been a Vorthak slave colony for over 2 centuries. Its population of various conquered species had been forced to extract rare minerals under brutal conditions, their lives considered expendable as long as the Empire's quotas were met. Now, as Vorthak overseers prepared to depart, they found themselves face to face with beings they had never considered as individuals. "Why are you leaving?" asked Delrix Nan, an elderly Cetian who had spent 60 years in the mines. "Are you planning to return with more weapons?" Daxiel Moore struggled to find words. The question seemed simple, but the answer required him to acknowledge that his entire civilization had been fundamentally wrong about everything. "We are leaving because we were told to leave by beings far wiser than ourselves," he finally said. "And no, we will not return." The systematic dismantling of the Vorthak Empire proceeded with mechanical precision across hundreds of worlds. But the Guardians didn't simply destroy what the Empire had built, they transformed it. Slave facilities became centers of learning. Military installations became spaceports for newly free populations. The vast infrastructure of conquest was repurposed into the foundation for a more equitable galactic civilization. Humanity watched these developments with fascination and growing understanding. The Guardian artifact continued to expand their knowledge, but it also taught them about responsibility. With greater technological capabilities came greater obligations to use those capabilities wisely. "We're being prepared for something." Coordinator Ashcraft realized during a strategic planning session. "The Guardians didn't just save our colony, they're preparing us to help manage the transition period as the Vorthak Empire collapses." The insight proved correct. Within weeks, human diplomatic vessels began appearing throughout former Vorthak territory, not as conquerors, but as facilitators. Their role was to help newly freed populations establish their own governments, mediate disputes between different species, and ensure that the power vacuum left by the Empire's withdrawal didn't lead to chaos. It was demanding work that required skills humanity had never needed to develop on such a scale, but the Guardian artifact continued to provide guidance. More importantly, it provided perspective. Humans began to understand that they were part of a vast cosmic community that spanned millions of years and countless civilizations. The black ships continued to appear occasionally, usually during moments of particular tension or difficulty. They never intervened directly, but their presence served as a reminder that the galaxy's young species were not alone in their struggles. But the greatest transformation was happening within the Vorthak themselves. 3 years after the Guardian intervention, the galaxy looked fundamentally different. The Vorthak Empire's collapse had created opportunities for dozens of formerly enslaved species to establish their own civilizations, while humanity had emerged as an unexpected mediating force in the complex process of galactic reorganization. Daxiel Moore, the former Vorthak commander, now served as a liaison between his people and the new galactic community. The role was a strange one for a being who had spent centuries perfecting the art of conquest, but he was discovering that leadership could take many forms. The hegemony of restored worlds requests assistance with establishing trade protocols. He reported to the Galactic Transition Council, a mixed-species organization that had evolved from humanity's initial diplomatic efforts. Their primary export is refined crystallium, but they lack the infrastructure for large-scale interstellar commerce. The irony wasn't lost on him. For centuries, the Vorthak had extracted crystallium from those same worlds through forced labor. Now he was helping their former slaves establish profitable trade relationships with other species across the galaxy. Lieutenant Cass Valderon, now promoted to Director of Guardian Studies, had spent the intervening years working to understand the cosmic perspective that the Guardians represented. The artifact they had left behind continued to reveal new layers of knowledge, but it was also teaching humanity about the responsibilities that came with advanced technology. The Guardians aren't gods, she explained during a presentation to the Transition Council. They're what we might become if we survive long enough to gain true wisdom. They represent the end result of a civilization that learned to prioritize preservation over conquest, balance over dominance. The most profound changes were happening within individual species. The Vorthak, stripped of their empire but not their intelligence, had begun to redirect their considerable capabilities toward construction rather than destruction. Former military engineers were designing habitats for refugee populations. Ex-conquest specialists were becoming experts in cultural integration and peaceful coexistence. The transformation wasn't easy. Centuries of imperial conditioning couldn't be overcome overnight, and there were still Vorthak factions that resented the loss of their dominion. But the presence of the Guardian ships, visible occasionally in the deep spaces between stars, served as a constant reminder that some powers in the universe were beyond challenge. Humanity, meanwhile, was growing into its role as galactic mediators, with a combination of enthusiasm and trepidation. The Guardian artifact had accelerated their technological development by several centuries, but it had also taught them that technological advancement without moral development led to the kind of empire that the Vorthak had built. "We're being tested," Coordinator Ashcraft observed during a private meeting with the council leadership. "Every decision we make, every policy we implement, is being evaluated by intelligences that have watched civilizations rise and fall for millions of years." The test was ongoing and complex. Former Vorthak territories needed to be reorganized without creating new power imbalances. Different species with conflicting cultural values needed to learn to coexist peacefully. Resource allocation had to be managed across dozens of worlds with varying technological capabilities. But gradually, a new kind of galactic civilization began to emerge. Instead of the hierarchical empire that the Vorthak had created, the galaxy was developing into a network of independent but interconnected communities. Trade flowed based on mutual benefit rather than extraction. Conflicts were resolved through negotiation rather than conquest. And throughout it all, the black ships of the Guardians watched and waited. On the 5th anniversary of the Battle of New Byzantium, as historians had begun calling it, something unprecedented happened. Every Guardian ship in the galaxy simultaneously opened communication channels and broadcast a single message to all civilized worlds. The young shepherds have learned well. The galaxy is ready for the next phase of its development. We withdraw to the deep void, but we do not disappear. When you are ready to join us in watching over the cosmos's youngest children, you will know how to find us. The black ships faded from normal space, returning to whatever dimension they called home. But they left behind a galaxy that had been fundamentally transformed by their intervention. where once the Vorthak Empire had spread through conquest and domination, now a community of independent worlds worked together toward mutual prosperity. Humanity had found its place in the cosmic order, not as conquerors or victims, but as gardeners helping to tend the ever-growing garden of galactics, civilization. The lesson of the Guardians was clear. True strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when and how to preserve. In the years that followed, as new species achieved spaceflight and joined the galactic community, they would learn the story of the day when alien armies marched forward, until the black ships made them disappear without a trace. And in learning that story, they would understand that the universe was vast enough for all civilizations to thrive, if only they chose cooperation over conquest. The Guardians had returned to the void between stars, but their legacy lived on. In every peaceful trade agreement, every diplomatic solution, and every decision to build rather than destroy. The galaxy had been given a second chance, and its younger species were determined not to waste it. In the end, the greatest victory was not the defeat of a single empire, but the birth of a civilization mature enough to shepherd itself toward a better future. The black ships had shown them the way, but the journey was theirs to make. And somewhere in the deep void between galaxies, ancient beings who had once been young themselves watched with approval as their newest students took their first steps toward true wisdom.